Good day, everyone. This will be the continuation of our risk management process as discussed in the previous video. I would suggest that you watch that or view that so that you can connect with the subsequent discussions. Actually, this particular part here is a continuation which I cut on the first video because of the time considerations. But anyhow, allow me to mention that this is actually the sub-step 5 of actually the step 2, which is again putting the risks into context in, for example, external or internal, and depending on the case or situation. So we have to take note that whatever the context is, that will be taken into account because the structure for risk analysis will have to be aligned. In fact, as seen and discussed here in the first bulleted point, we have to isolate the categories of risk that you want to manage. We want the risks to be managed as much as possible to the lowest minimum or minimal levels. This will provide greater depth and accuracy in identifying significant risks. The chosen structure for risk analysis will depend upon the type of activity or issue, its complexity, and the context of the risks. I would say that the more risky or the riskier or the more risks there are on a certain business or entity or account or whatever basis that we have, then that would of course result to, I would say, a more complex structure as compared with those items with lesser risks. All right, so now we will formally proceed to step 3, and we are going to identify the risks. We cannot manage the risks unless we are able to identify them or know them. Basically, that's true, because how can we manage something without knowing it in the first place? And once the context of the business has been defined, the next step is to utilize the information to identify as many risks as possible. So we cannot say that there's just 2 or 3 or what. It depends upon the business that we are examining or evaluating or assessing with. The aim of risk identification is to identify possible risks that may affect, either negatively or positively, the objectives of the business and the activity under analysis. We have to answer the following questions to identify the risk. What can happen? How can it happen? And why could it happen? What can, how can, and why could it happen? Those are basically the 3 questions. What can? So we have to state as to what, and then in what way that such can happen and why do they happen. Next to that, to the point, identify the risks, there are 2 main ways. First is identifying retrospective risks. From the word retro, meaning past, we are going to look back from the past. And then in this, as defined, retrospective risks are those that have previously occurred, such as incidents or accidents. And from there, we learn from the experience. This is the most common way to identify and the easiest in terms of such, because it happened before and it's easier to believe such. It's also easier to quantify the impact and see the damage because, again, we have the past experiences to back up. Examples and sources, especially of the information about retrospective risk, are as follows. So normally these are records and accounts which contain historical information, like for example, for hazard or incident logs or registers that would contain hazard or incidences involving such. Audit reports about, let's say, the financial statements audit for historical financial statements of the company from past years, complaints from customers, accreditation documents and reports, past staff or client surveys, and the likes, newspapers or professional media such as journals or websites. So the information here would be historical in nature. Retrospective risks can be identified. From the experience, we can learn from them and we can apply such to our operation so that if ever they can happen next time, we would be able to diagnose them accordingly and properly and immediately and timely. The challenging one is about prospective risks, which would look into the future. Harder to identify, that's very true. They have not yet happened, but might happen sometime in the future. So in this case, we are now being proactive. Identification should include all risks, whether or not they are currently being managed, whether also they're manageable or not, but hopefully manageable. Because for manageable or acceptable, we have to just embrace them, since without them, we cannot anyway enjoy benefits and returns. We cannot have the business. But for the unacceptable ones, we have, of course, to reduce them as much as possible to the lowest minimum levels. The rationale here is to record all significant risks and monitor or review the effectiveness of their control. Now, what are the methods for identifying prospective risks? We can do brainstorming with staff or external stakeholders as to what can possibly happen. And this is also very true for any item or any post or situation that we are going to look into the future. That's going to be very challenging. Researching the economic, political, legislative, and operating environment. Now, here's the interesting thing. Normally, the two risks would be connected, since to be able to prospect or project, meaning to say, to estimate what can happen in the future or forecast. Now, remember, we are going also to look into the trend or pattern from the history. So that's why we are strongly connected. Next would be conducting interviews with relevant people and our organizations. And normally these people base also whatever questions that we raise to them on their lived experiences. So basically, still something to do with the past. Undertaking surveys of staff or clients to identify anticipated issues or problems. So the questions here would be, of course, geared towards the future. Flowcharting a process, making a graphical illustration of how the process would flow. Then by such, we can be able to see easily, because that's going to be friendly, hopefully, because not all flowcharts are friendly to the eyes. But let's say friendly, we can see now whatever weak or weaker areas in the system, and we can identify the risks that can also happen in the future. Next will be reviewing system design or preparing system analysis techniques. All right, so what are the tips for effective risk identification? We select a risk identification methodology appropriate to the type of risk and the nature of activity. Again, the type of the risk and the activity to be done would be aligned. Right people should also be involved, and take a life cycle approach to risk identification and determine how risks would change and evolve throughout this particular cycle. So it's like there's introduction, there's a part that it's going to grow and mature and decline, and it's going to end and begin again. All right, so now we have step 4, analyze the risks. From communicate and consult, establish the context. So steps 1 and 2 to identify the risk. Now step 4, analyze the risks. If we're able to identify the risk, then we can analyze them properly. And let's read the contents. During the risk identification step, a business owner may have identified many risks, and it is often not possible to try to address all those identified. It's very true. Again, risks could be significant or insignificant, and we have to be practical. Focus on significant risks. Insignificant risks, if we still have the time and the resources, since sometimes under cost-benefit approach, the cost of eliminating or even trying to eliminate insignificant risks could be higher than the benefits obtained. The risk analysis step will assist in determining which risks have a greater consequence or impact than the others. And the greater the consequence of the risks, I'm pretty sure that the more actions will be devoted, or more analysis could be devoted. Now, risk analysis involves combining the possible consequences or impact of an event. With the likelihood of that event occurring, the result is a level of risks. So with this formula, risk equals consequence, whatever that be, could be an amount, could be actions, times the likelihood that it can happen. And this formula, it's supposing that it's going to be quantitative or mathematical in nature. However, we can also apply other things like qualitative in nature. What are the elements? We have identify existing strategies and controls that act to minimize negative risk and enhance opportunities. This is a very great point. We want to minimize the negative risks, the chances of negative outcomes, and we focus or enhance the positive aspects, which are the opportunities. Then determine the consequences of a negative impact or an opportunity. It could be positive or negative. And number one, we have to identify the existing strategies and controls that would or that act to result to the consequences in number two. Number three is determine the likelihood. So what percentage? Number four, estimate the level of risk by combining the consequence, number two, and the likelihood. And consider and identify any uncertainties in the estimates that will have impact to our analysis. The types of analysis could be classified into three categories or types, could be qualitative, semi-quantitative, or quantitative. Let me begin with quantitative, which is of course going to deal with numbers. Semi-quantitative would be combination of numbers plus words or descriptives, qualitative. So semi-quantitative is in the middle. But the most common type of risk analysis is the qualitative method because it's going to be very challenging to translate items to figures or amounts. To be able to use our formula risk equals consequences times likelihood in mathematical version. Now, tips for effective risk analysis would be also, let's look into this. Risk analysis is usually done in the context of existing controls, and we have to identify them properly. The risk analysis methodology selected should, where possible, be comparable to the significance and complexity of the risk being identified. We've mentioned this, we focus on the significant items, and normally they would result also to complex risk structures, and therefore the risk analysis could also be extensive or intensive. For example, the higher the potential consequence, the more rigorous the methodology. It's very true. We have to be very serious about analyzing such. Risk analysis tools are designed to help rank or prioritize risks. To do this, they must be designed for the specific context and the risk or the risk dimension under analysis. And our step 5, evaluate the risks. For this one, we evaluate whatever we have analyzed, and this would involve comparing the level of risk found during the analysis process with previously established risk criteria, and we have to decide. So with that, are we going to do some treatment or treatments? The result of a risk evaluation is a prioritized list of risks that require further action. This step is about deciding whether risks are acceptable or need treatment. And if acceptable, normally we just going to state it as it is so that we can have the benefits, but for the unacceptable, we can, of course, minimize them by doing some treatments. Risk acceptance may be for the following reasons. The cost of treatment far exceeds the benefit. This is what we have mentioned about CBA approach or cost benefit analysis approach. So no other way but to accept them. But this is going to apply to lower ranked risks. We mentioned about such a while ago that for insignificant risks, normally this would be the situation. The level of the risk is so low that specific treatment is not appropriate with available resources. That's also true. Normally for insignificant items, they would result to unique treatments. Opportunities presented outweigh the threats to such a degree that the risk is justified. So very check. Positive is greater than negative. The risk is such that there is no treatment available. So we cannot really do about it. Like, for example, the risk that the business may suffer from storm damage. Yeah. Acts of God or fortuitous events or natural calamities would be something that we are not in control of. We might be able to minimize the impact that they can do to the business, but we cannot really eliminate that particular risk or chance that it may affect the business. And step 6, which is also a challenging part, is treat the risks. Risk treatment is about considering options for treating risks that were not considered acceptable or tolerable at step 5. Let me go back. Here is risk acceptance. If ever such would not be acceptable because it did not or they did not satisfy these reasons, so that's why we treat them. And risk treatment involves identifying options for treating or controlling risk in order to either reduce or eliminate negative consequences. And that's very true. Or to reduce the likelihood of an adverse occurrence. So we want to treat so that we can say overall, and we can really apply overall, to reduce or eliminate negative consequences. Eliminate could be challenging, but reduce can be workable, especially to prevent, in a way, the likelihood of an adverse occurrence. So just reduce, not totally eliminate. Risk treatment should also aim to enhance positive outcomes. Of course, invest more on the positive than the negative. Options for risk treatment. Here are some options in order to minimize the negative risk and to have increased positive risk or increased positive risk. Number 1 is to avoid it, avoid the risk. Number 2 is, by the way, these are options. They are not step by step, so we can just select. 2 is change the likelihood of the occurrence. It's possible that by certain ways or means, we can decrease the occurrence of the negative outcomes. For the positive, we can increase. Change the consequences and, of course, the results or outcome. There could be some ways by doing that so that there would be lesser risks. I would say, for example, let's say we are using roofs of our buildings which are not durable before, and now we change to glasses, for example. So with that, we can have lesser chances of destroyed roofs because of calamities. Number 4 is to share the risk. This is good, especially for financial management concept of diversification. If this is just all about investments, wherein we can have portfolio approach in that the investments will be placed in different combinations or percentages of investment. So for example, 60% equity, 40% debt, and the like. So with that, diversification will be able to minimize the risk because the risks are shared throughout various classes of investments. 5 is to retain the risk, meaning to have it as it is. That could be an option also for treatment. And the tips. The key to managing risk is in implementing effective treatment options. That's very true. So after we have identified and analyzed the risk, we are going to treat them accordingly based on the proper analysis. And when implementing the plan, we have to ensure that there are adequate resources available. Aside from that, time frame is there, and responsibilities and the method for monitoring progress against the plan is there, so that we'll be able to get the feedback if we are able to reach the standards and the benchmarks and quotas or targets. We can also see that in the next step. Physically check that the treatment implemented reduces the residual risk level. So risks, example for certain alternatives, would have differential risks or incremental risks, meaning to say marginal or the difference of the two risks. So with that, we focus on the marginal or residue to be able to properly treat such risks, and should be that overall the residual risk level would be reduced. In order of priority, undertake remedial measures to reduce the risk. So there are some problems that can be remedied or solved. So with that, we can still minimize the risk. And finally, step 7, monitor and review, which is our last step. This is an essential integral step in the risk management process, in that this is a connection of our prior steps to this. Then A business owner must monitor risks and review the effectiveness of the treatment plan, strategies, and management system that have been set up to effectively manage the risk and hopefully efficiently so that we can also make sure that our resources have been consumed in the least possible manner without sacrificing the quality of the services that we are providing or that has been provided to the business that we are looking into for risk management. Now, the owner must monitor risks, and it's not that easy to monitor. The point of that is we are able to again see the feedback if you are able to identify the differences among the alternatives or the options and of course the different risk levels. And so we should be able to diagnose properly. And with that, we can apply to the next stage in this, wherein we can see establish the context. And then for monitor and review, so that is also strongly connected with treating the risk. So it's going to be a cycle. We are going to go back to establish the context. Then again, to continue, risks need to be monitored periodically to ensure changing circumstances do not alter the risk priorities. In a business landscape we're in, changes are everywhere, changes are there. So circumstances would be ever changing. We have to monitor. So this is a concept of Kaizen or continuous improvement. In that, we want that any rooms for improvement will be carried forward to the next planning stage, down to implementation, and finally to, again, this particular part here about monitoring and controlling. Very few risks will remain the same or static. Therefore, the risk management process needs to be regularly repeated so that new risks are captured in the process and effectively managed. Therefore, just like the management functions from planning down to controlling, risk management process is also a never-ending process. Risk management plan at the business level should be reviewed at least on an annual basis. It is very important. It's going to be at least annual because it's big. It's the business as a whole as compared to performance risk management plan, in which that can be done, for example, even weekly, depending on the jobs. An effective way to ensure that this occurs is to combine risk planning or risk review with annual business planning. Of course, if we plan for the business, we also look into the risk management and how risk is being managed accordingly. And finally, these are the contents. You can see here the specific parts of our risk management steps and process. And this is the summary, of course, from communicate and consult down to monitor and review. So just to summarize again, the flow is from communicate and consult to establish the concept of the context of the risk management and the risk, of course. Then for risk assessment, we identify, analyze, and evaluate the risks. For identify the risk, these are the questions in which we have mentioned a while ago. For analyze the risk, though, which is not shown directly and straightforwardly on the slides about analyzing the risk, we determine the existing controls, determine the probability or chance, estimate the level of risk. So that's going to be connected also with determining the consequence from determining existing controls. Controls, by the way, are steps, procedures, policies, programs that are in place in order to ensure that the operations are effective and efficient accordingly. So that's why we have to determine these existing controls. The chance is determined, the consequence or the result of such being, let's say, negative or positive would also be determined. And by then, we can estimate the level of the risks. Next would be we evaluate the risks. So we compare such with criteria and we set priorities. Shall we treat the risks? Yes, again, for our unacceptable risks. For the acceptable, then of course not needed. So we can proceed to monitor and review. So that's why a while ago on the diagram, we can just go directly, not treat the risks wherein we identify options and assess our respective options. So allow me to minimize this one so that we can see the particular diagram. All right, so let me go back to that. Okay, so here, yeah, after identifying and assessing options, we prepare also treatment plans. And finally, monitor and review. All right. So with that, thank you very much for listening. Hopefully you learned something from this session. Thank you very much and God bless, and stay tuned for updates of this particular channel.